good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on your time zone. And welcome to IC Moon's closing ceremony and another interview of the Baton Project, the initiative that connects us with politicians and accomplished academia leaders. Today, we have the privilege to be with Mr. Marco Midence. He is the Minister of Presidential Priorities, Public Innovation, and Digital Government. He will be discussing with us today world order, from ideological to religious. Hello, Mr. Midence, how are you?
Hi, Orlando. Thank you for having us here in your program. It's a privilege and a pleasure to be discussing with you and the audience that we have today from all over the world, some issues pertaining world order, and very important for us to address this from our scope that we are living this pandemic since it was 102 years ago that the world has had an event of this kind. So it's quite interesting to be discussing this with you. I want to congratulate all the people who are participating in the UN model, and it will be a pleasure to be talking to you guys today.
Okay, so thank you very much, Mr. Midence. So here I understand that you have prepared a lecture for us. So by all means, the floor is now yours.
Thank you. I have a bit of a lag, but if you're okay, I'm going to start then.
Yes.
Okay, so discussing this world issues is something that we sometimes don't do on a daily basis. I am currently serving in public office, and it is my duty to be addressing real-time complex problems right now we're handling in Honduras. Nonetheless, it's very important for us to understand the context in the world we're at. To become leaders and agents of change, we really have to understand where we're located in this pale blue dot that we have as a position in the universe. So mainly I would like to start briefly giving some remarks regarding some concepts of systems of world order and seeing how this some shifts might we experience in the short term, and what grounds we might see in the middle and long term in the future. By any means, please interrupt if you have any questions. I understand I'm going to have some minutes to give the opening remarks, and then we're going to go with 5 questions or 4 questions, right, Orlando?
Yes, about 4.
Okay, great. So one important concept when we're talking about world order is to start from the outset from one concept that is very important, and it's statecraft. Statecraft is basically the doing of foreign policy. And we have to make a distinction with some key ideas in regards to our position as individuals in this area of particular studies. So we have basically 2 ideas that we encounter in these areas of study. One is what some experts call the great person theory, and then some experts also called the other theory, the deep forces theory, which is the predominant. There we have a question that one professor of mine had Professor Hare in Harvard. He told us that the individual does make a difference, but with a context, within a context. It's very, very important to understand that. We cannot judge someone if not by the context that they took the decisions, where they took the decision, and the worldview and the cultural and traditional aspects of the way they're seeing the world. So world politics, we might say, has a system, which is the context, and the states have certain resources, and the intersection between the system and the states is where we find the state person and where we do statecraft. The framework that we're talking about, we might want to talk about types of systems as well. If we look down into history, we might look at imperial Rome, medieval Europe, the rise of the Industrial Revolution, and right now that we're seeing the fourth Industrial Revolution to many, or the second machine age. So right at the center of international politics, there's a very clear distinction of other two key concepts. I mean, three concepts that I want to talk a little bit about when we go into the question and Q&A part, is that, as we've said, we have the system, we have the state, we have the state person, and we have different views, the great person theory, if individuals or heroes do the difference, or deep forces. And we said that we think that the individual does make a difference, but within the context. Now, when we go to the international arena and we start thinking about the international politics through the lens of the differentiation from domestic policy, three key concepts that we have to understand, Orlando. One is that in the international arena, there is no central authority. That is a very distinct aspect from the domestic policy. We don't have a state that has the monopoly of violence, as Weber said. We don't have a state or a universal government. So there is no central authority. The law is fragile. That is something that we understand from the reality of the different worldviews on the conceptions of warfare and the clashes between what we've seen in the past, in the recent past. So law is fragile, and there is a fragile consensus of values as well. And that is something that we have to maybe talk a little bit about further. But so these three key ideas: no central authority, law is fragile in the international arena, and there's a concept of identity or tribal politics. So the contemporary system is basically dominant. I mean, it's basically seen with the lens of this concept. Now I want to go over very briefly some of the predominant schools of international relations and their thoughts. And I would like just to give a very brief overview of what's realism and what's liberalism. Very important, because those are the dominant theories in the last century, or 120 years at least, and that's the way we've seen the world and studied the international relations. So let me start very quickly by talking a little bit about realism. Realism is the dominant theory. It is a product of the 20th century, and it is a very analytical structure rather than a descriptive structure. We know that there's been at least three kinds of, or the historical background goes back to the classical realism. We can talk about Thucydides, we can talk about Hobbes, and we can talk about Machiavelli as well. We know the story behind these guys and their concepts, but then we have the modern realism, which is very important for us to understand the after or post World War II, and then what they call the failure of liberalism between 1919 and 1929, that led, in fact, to a world of a very depressing view after the Great War, 1918. And then we have contemporary realism or neo-realism, where there's a look at human nature and history as well. So very quickly, because of time, I want to go over the premises of realism. I wrote down a few. One of the premises, and the look or the view of the human nature, and the view of history, and the concept of national interest, which is something that you might have heard about, is that realism at its heart is very pessimistic. It is pessimistic, and it says that human beings have flawed inclinations dominate. Well, that's a statement that we can be, when we read Hobbes, for example, and the famous phrase, right, or the famous homo homini lupus, we understand that maybe there's a state of violence where we're inclined to as a nature, right? And then politics in this realism concept is viewed as a real struggle of power, right? As a constant struggle, and state then become just rational actors pursuing their interest, and that is power, the pursuit of the national interest. From this concept or point of view, then we might seem to think that peace is fragile as well. That maybe the order or the world order is basically from war to war, and that peace is just a hiatus, that it's very fragile. The state then understands power as the pursuit of national interest, and we don't necessarily have the over pessimistically view as whoever has of the definition of state as a monopoly of violence, but that is definitely an ingredient. About ethics, there's a very interesting intersection about thoughts between politics and ethics, and statecraft and ethics. And I think that realism gives us a very interesting lens. Realism is suspicious to ethics. And why do we have to impose moral views or ethic restraints in the use of power if the pursuit of power is a national interest? It is very complex. The consequences but might have good intentions, but there is no reliable or true outcome. So we have this view. Now let me turn the page to the other view, which might we think about as a more optimistic view, of a more enlightened view of human history and human nature, which is the liberal ideas, right? Liberalism. We have different versions of liberalism. We understand that we have democratic liberalism that has impacted the world in the last 200 years or so. Economic liberalism, which is a very important view and has dominated Western culture and countries in the Western Hemisphere. And then we have the institutional liberalism and moral liberalism. And very quickly, just to finish up and wrapping this up, let me talk a little bit about some premises that I wrote about liberalism that might give you some context of the questions that we're gonna then address. First, it is a more enlightened view of human nature, as I told you. There's a sense of perfectibility, of progress, that we have. The view is that there is the possibility of progress in human nature in the construction of a worldview. And it understands that the state is a key actor, but there are many other institutions. Remember that when we talked about the world systems, we talked about the state, and we talked about the system, and then the intersection between the state and the system, we have the statesperson, right? Making decisions in the real world. Now for the realism view, there's the state as the rational actor and the main actor. But for the liberal view, we have other actors which are not necessarily the state. We have transnational actors that compete with the state in some areas. There is a concept of deep interdependence and globalization. There's like a view of a pacifying force, let's say, of progress, right? So there is a concept that war is not a necessity. We don't need or necessarily jump from war to war in the progress of human history and human nature. And there is, in fact, a belief in national interest, but those interests can change. But there's also a concept of pluralism of power, not only engaging in the national interest and seeking the national interest in the view of the state person, or the concept of how the statecraft is done, or the doing of foreign policy, but a rather higher concept of progress and view of state power. And then the ethics of the liberal view is of course open to the idea of ethics as a binding force. So ethics does have a place in international relations, as in the view of the liberal writers and authors. So with this, I hope to have given you a very open framework to learn at, Rolando.
Okay, so
yeah.
Before moving on to the prepared questions, I just wanted to ask you how does the three concepts, one of them was no central authority, and the one, the realism, it's a dominance theory. How does those two concepts interact with each other, since they're kind of opposite? Because with the dominance theory, there's this like will to dominate the world and therefore become a central authority.
Well, it's something that we have to clarify. So realism is the dominant theory, right? It is the dominant theory in regards that many statesperson and many people doing foreign policy in the world see realism as the dominating theory, as the way that we see and the way that we act upon using state resources and the vision that the state might have. This doesn't necessarily mean that there's an appetite for world domination, right? This means that every state seeking their national interest have a clear view of what their interest is, and they're going to act upon that principle. So when I referred to realism as a dominant theory, I was telling you that between realism and liberalism, the school of thought that many authors and many presidents and many heads of states have, or at least the intellectuals have seen as a more dominant or dominating theory, is realism. Many decisions are made basically on the concept of what is the national interest, and that is like the basic premise where they act upon. And then when we're talking about the international system, Rolando, I want to be pessimistic, but that's the reality. We don't have a world government. We don't have a central authority. It's very interesting to remember the president from the United States that was leading the pandemic in the 102 years ago. I mean, Woodrow Wilson, and he was a very liberal, or the personification of liberalism for some. And Wilson ideas and thoughts were to that grandiose idea of the possibility of human progress through concepts larger than the only mere concept of states. Remember that Wilson was the one who thought and led the failed League of Nations. Nonetheless, in 1945, after the world had seen two of the most horrific events in his history, we've had the foundation of the United Nations, and now we have a system where we can talk about the concept of convergence in some areas, but really, Rolando, we don't have a true dominant legal or military authority or world government. We do have a consensus and a convergence of countries where we understand that there's a minimum of the minimum that we might have to respect, but there is the reality that there's no central authority, there's no set of values that we share 100% with all nations in the world, and there's no legal framework where we can sanction countries in the same way that we can have, for example, sanctions in the domestic realm.
Great. Yeah, I just wanted to make that clarification because it snapped when I heard those two concepts mixing up. So moving on to our prepared questions, I wanted to discuss about a theory that the political scientist Samuel P. Huntington has about world order. He argued that after the Soviet Union collapsed, the world conflicts evolved from ideological to religious. What do you think this means for the global hegemony of the Western Bloc we have known throughout the 20th century?
Well, first of all, Rolando, we do have to acknowledge that this is a book that sparked a lot of criticism with ideas that had been argued since its publication. I read it when I was studying when I had some of my graduate studies. Nevertheless, even the biggest critics of Huntington must admit that he was a brilliant scholar, and the modern classic, the book is a modern classic in the fields of political science. And let me start by giving you a general view about this book, which I think that Huntington was partially right. There has, of course, been a series of conflicts and events that have been partially triggered by religion, culture, ethnicity. We understand that before Westphalia, for example, religion was at the core and ethnicity was at the core of warfare. Today we have different kinds of conflicts. We have many theories. We have been reading Dr. Mainwaring's ideas of the fourth generation warfares. We've been reading Lawrence Friedman's book about strategy and seeing the different kinds of engagements. And we have seen, for example, in the last months, the development of trade war. We talk about tech war, economical war, cyber attacks across the world. And then, Rolando, something very important and that we have to now understand in the reality of Latin America for the people who are not from here, non-state actors that also have participation, for example, such as gangs in the Northern Triangle, and specifically in Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, fighting not for religion, not for ethnicity, but for money, right? Part of criminal organizations. Last year, we had a profound ideological crisis, for example, across Latin America, called Viento Bolivarianos, Ola Bolivariana, the Bolivar wins, with massive crowds protesting against economic and social inequality and claiming this was caused by free capitalist system or neoliberalism economic model. So these are a few examples that might evince what we might still have as ideological conflicts, and that of course, not all wars result from religion or cultural conflict, sorry, but it depends, Rolando, on the perspective of how you see things and the lens to which you see them.
So yeah, you mentioned vientos bolivarianos and all that, and that leads me to my next question, of which I wanted to ask, where does Latin America stand in this new world order? Because we know that Islam is on the rise, the Orthodox civilization, the Western Bloc, but Latin America doesn't fit with that Western Bloc. So where do we stand as a society in this new world order?
Well, of course that I am biased because I am from Latin America. Whenever I spoke with my colleagues during our graduate studies and we read a lot of literature, we said that Central America, for example, sometimes is marginalized. But Latin America is really increasingly becoming more important in geopolitics, as is of course has a lot of vast natural resources in high demands, yet still we have many political and social challenges. That's caused by an enormous social and economic disparities that we might see. We for example, have some of the most highest rates of inequality in the world, weak government institutions, there's a lack of proper public health and education systems in many nations across Latin America, and the inability to diversify and modernize the supply chains. Even in agriculture, we have some challenges. There are some authors like Jared Diamond that says that geography has a lot to do, and the way that we're positioned, the way that we were our civilization started. But today we also see that there are some issues that we have had in the last 500 years, let's say, of our history. We also see what some might consider a violation of the Monroe Doctrine, or America for America, as China is consistently opening the diplomatic, economic, and technological channels to spread the influence in the American continent. That is a conversation that we might have when we look at the system as a bipolar or multipolar system, sorry.
Okay, so I'm very sorry to interrupt you, just that our time for the closing ceremony has ended. So do you have any last words for the young generations and for the betterment of the world?
Well, it is very important for us to understand the context that we're in. It's absolutely important for us to understand that we can become agents of change, that change is incremental when we seek the help and we build community. You have to prepare to be the best leader, but leadership is multiplication. Leadership is not another thing, but that addressing problems, the problems that you, Rolando, and the young people of the world, well, myself, are going to address in our lifetime are real complex problems, problems that need for us to be calm, for us to be focused, and for us to be adaptive as well. There's a misconception that failure is not an option. Failure is in fact an option, but the importance of leadership is understanding when to get up and when to learn from failure. We're going to be battling many battles in our lives. And when we pose as public persons or public people or public servants, we have to understand that the problems and the issues are going to be sometimes felt as larger than ourselves, or large as something that we cannot address by ourselves. But if we build community, if we understand our conception of leadership as adaptive leadership, as a concept where you engage problems, understand them, iterate, go back, reflect, and act, go back, reflect, and act. And that is something where you might have the possibility of pushing forward, of having progress, of believing in the possibility of changing with small steps the world. I am very happy and pleased to have talked about these important issues. For all the people that want to go into public service or want to run for office or have positions in leadership, we have to understand that there's a real complex world out there, and that we have to have moral values and our focus on solving with this mindset in front of us. Thank you, Rolando, for having us today. It was a very pleasant and interesting chat. And congratulations, and hope that everything is okay, and that we survive this pandemic and thrive as well after that. So thanks a lot, and cheers.
Thank you very much, Mr. Midence, and thanks to the audience for listening. And we are now out.